Here you can see 20 minutes in, the yeast are already going at it. You can probably even see a bit of a color change. You can definitely see foam on the top of the yeast. They are definitely having a feast, which we kind of expected. So we'll keep checking back. It's a few hours later, so still the first day, a few hours into this experiment. You can see that the yeast is really ripping into the sugars, so you're seeing a lot of color change there. And as expected, the rest of it is kind of not changed very much. We are maybe a little bit over 12 hours in. It looks to me like the sig yeast has gotten a little bit redder, but since I'm just recording this on camera right now, it's hard to do side-by-side comparisons, but we'll do side-by-side comparisons. We are at 24 hours. We'll do some comparison shots. It seems to me like maybe they're ever so slightly redder, especially the Siggies all the way on the left. But that's where we are now, 24 hours in. We're at about 36 hours. You can actually see some deposits of materials on the side of the glass now. We'll have to do, again, comparisons. Maybe my memory fails. A little bit of foam at the top of the yogurt ones as well. So 36 hours. "48 hours in, looking a little bit redder, but maybe that's just because I want it to look redder. So I'm taking pictures and we'll do comparison shots. So 48 hours. Our experiment continues here, and I apologize, there will be some camera work here, because you'll notice I have cracked out my pH meters, and I have taken a slightly more accurate pH reading for each of these reactions to give us an idea what the actual pHs actually are, aside from these colors that we're looking at for the slightly red. So here, relative to the scale for the Siggies with sugar, you'll notice we're floating somewhere between 4 and 4.4. For the Phi-A, we're in a similar region. With the yeast, this was actually somewhat more apparent earlier, but this is actually a little bit lower pH. This was somewhere between a 3.6 and 4.0 rather than higher up the scale. And then last but not least, back to the Siggies, but this time with malt extract. So we're looking at, back again, high 4s, or slightly above 4. Now, that brings the scripted portion of this to an end. And in fact, if we look particularly closely, you can see that there's stuff growing in there that isn't really supposed to grow in there. In fact, in this case, you can even see an actual patch of mold. So these are not surviving well, and they are not smelling great. But just to push the situation a little bit, because I'm curious now, I would never drink any of this, so I suggest you never drink any of this. Well, I'm going to add a little bit of yeast to the ones that haven't had yeast in them and see what happens in another day. Since it is the yeast that is the lowest pH one right now, I'll be interested to see if I add yeast to the other ones, whether those will outcompete and drop even lower in pH. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to try to keep them sufficiently sealed that I don't have to smell them. Well, today is going to be the last check-in on our slowly rotting friends. You can notice that there's a yeast cake in the bottom of each of the reactions now, and they're all much redder. So the yeast definitely made all of the solutions significantly more acidic. And actually, if we're looking, the one that's pure yeast is kind of a solid red. The other ones are kind of orangey color. Although I do think that that is probably a significant portion influenced by the fact that they still have some leftover coloration from just having yogurt in them, period. And so that color is perhaps not the most reliable. But the thing that you can notice is that they all got a lot more acidic, because as you digest sugars with yeast, that makes the samples more acidic. Twofold. One, you are making carbon dioxide, so that's making the solution more acidic because you're making carbonic acid by having it form in the water. And two, chances are there's some other side products in there from the yeast that are probably also making it slightly more acidic. But I would guess it's predominantly the carbon dioxide, which is important to know. So I'm going to crack out a couple of those little pH strips and see if we can get any better data on that. And then we might look inside those jars, but let me tell you, it's not going to be pretty. Let's give this a shot. You can probably see the muck in there. It is not smelling nice. So I'm going to give this pH thing a test. Here you're looking at somewhere between 3.6 and 3.2, so it's definitely gone more acidic. Let's look at our second one. So in order, we had Siggy's. The second one is our Faye. So we're looking at about the same kind of acidity here. So there's not a lot of difference between our two different sources of bacteria, but you can definitely see that it's gotten a lot more acidic than it was the last time around. You'll notice, actually, consistent with what one might expect, this didn't get any more acidic. This is still sitting at somewhere between 3.6 and 4.0. So that was the one that only had yeast in it. We wouldn't have expected anything extra to happen to it in the last couple of days. It might have digested a little bit more CO2, but it wasn't going to be anything dramatic. And then our last sample, this is from the malt extract. So we're still sitting in that 3.6. This seems a little bit less acidic than the other two were that had yogurt in it, but sitting somewhere on the acidity scale near where we might expect it to. So that gives us a little bit of insight, and you can also see kind of the muck that's growing inside all of our different samples. I will give you some close-ups of that. So let's go take a flight. I would venture to guess that some of that stuff floating on the top is probably just yogurt that's precipitated out and curdled. but especially on this very first one, you can actually see the mold that's growing in there. So that's one of the reasons why you got to be careful about what is infecting your samples, your jars. And sanitation is important. And that brings that experiment to a close. If you listen very carefully, you might actually hear a little bit of carbonation escaping. I did not expect to get that lucky.